Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and on today's episode, we have a really cool guest for you today. We got to speak with Maria Leijerstam, who comes from us all the way from Wales, and she actually holds a Guinness World Record as she used a trike to go from the edge of Antarctica all of the way to the South Pole. It was like 600 kilometers, over 600 kilometers, I should say. It took more than 10 days. And she shares with us her experiences, the challenges that came with it, and not just from the cold, but also the uneven terrain going uphill, almost getting caught in avalanches and other close calls that could have turned out really, really bad for her. So it was an absolutely fantastic chat that we had. So let's get right into it. But first, a word from today's sponsor.
Hi, I'm Natasha Laframboise, sales representative with the Laframboise team at Realty Executives Local Group Inc. Brokerage. We are a local real estate team here in North Bay. Our team of sales representatives, Matt Laframboise, Phil Seguin, and Adam Negro, are ready to help you through the buying and selling experience. We have been providing service to the North Bay and area community for over 17 years. Our goal is to provide knowledge, support, and guidance in order to prepare your home for sale, bring it to market using multiple selling strategies, and get it sold. As a home buyer, we have 2 buyer's agents ready to help you find your home sweet home. If you'd like to know more, check us out on our website, laframboiseteam.ca. We are always happy to help.
Well, we've had the honor on this podcast to have many amazing and interesting guests from all over North America, but for the first time, we're going across the pond, as some call it, across the Atlantic, and joining us from South Wales is Maria Leijerstam. Maria, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
I was very nervous I was going to mess up that.
No, you did well, Ben. But just think about it, and for all the listeners everywhere around the world, because this is one of these worldly shows, just think about, Ben, how many people anywhere in the world know someone that's actually been to either the North Pole and the South Pole. You've been to both. And this particular story and this trek to the South Pole is totally amazing because it emanated from a story we did earlier with Chris in BC, in British Columbia, when we talked about trikes and the like. And it came up right away in our conversation with Chris because you're, Maria, the inspiration for him and his trike. He has accessibility challenges like no other, and the trike has given him that personal freedom. But that's only part of the story because Maria's here, and we are so pleased, as you say, Ben, to have her here.
Yeah, and this is a really cool story because, Maria, you're the first person, according to Wikipedia, and we all know that Wikipedia doesn't lie, you're the first person to reach the South Pole entirely by cycling. So when I first hear that, I immediately think you cycled across water because I'm like, what does that mean? So why don't you just let us know, what does that mean? What was the journey and what does it mean by cycling the entire South Pole?
Yeah, take us to the accomplishments first, and then we'll go, before all that occurred and the inspiration behind that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I've got to admit, I've never been to Canada, and that is one of the things that's top on my list. So I'm going to come and visit you guys one day. But yeah, so gosh, over 10 years ago now was when I went out and cycled to the South Pole. And basically, it all came about because I found out nobody had ever cycled from the edge of the Antarctic continent to the South Pole before. So what that means is where, of course, you go to Antarctica and there's a lot of ice. And the ice actually sprawls out over the sea as well. So you have sea ice and then you have land ice. And the record was to going from the edge of the actual continent. So not where the ice is with the water, it's where it's actually from the land. So, I cycled from the edge of the continent to the South Pole. And it was something that, it hadn't even really been thought of before until the year before I went out. A few other people started making noises about going out there and trying to do a similar thing. I was not experienced in this at all. I had to do a lot of preparation and training, which we can talk through later on. For me to actually go out there and cycle to the South Pole, I wanted to make sure I was going to cycle every metre of the way. I think a lot of terrain that we cross, we find out that we can't actually cycle. So it was really important that I had the right kit and the right equipment, and that's where this polar cycle came about. And I know that trikes are very much seen as, a machine for people with, physical disabilities. And it's brilliant for that because it gives you the stability. But, I'm a cyclist. I do mountain biking, I do road biking, etc. But for this particular expedition, the trike was absolutely the right machine for the job. And I have a lot to thank the builders, Inspired Cycle Engineering, for helping me with that project.
What's the difference for you between cycling on like a mountain bike or a normal bike versus triking? Like, what are the challenges that you had to overcome?
Well, I'd never been on a trike before. So probably it was just over a year before I was due to go. And having been to Siberia, having been to Iceland, having been to the Arctic with lots of training with my, two-wheel bike, I very quickly came to the conclusion that this is not going to work. If I want to cycle to the South Pole, don't take a two-wheel bike because you'll end up pushing it, carrying it, towing it on a sledge. Simply because you don't have the stability. When you cycle on snow and ice, you go at such slow speeds, you don't actually have the stability to stay upright on a bike. And that is just the fundamental principle required. So I had to have stability. And I did actually test with skis on my two-wheel bike, and I tested with other forms of stabilization. And then all of a sudden, this whole three-wheel concept came in. And then that's when I found out about a company in the UK, down in Cornwall, the far south west of the country. And they actually built three-wheeled trikes. And I went down there and I put the idea to them of what I was planning to do. And I said, look, can you guys help me with this? And they were, they never heard anything quite so ridiculous as most people haven't. But they were amazing. And they just said, yeah, let's make this happen. And we worked together and we developed the polar cycle. So it was roughly based on some of the trikes they had, but it didn't have the big wheels. This one had much different gearing system, the whole sort of dynamics of it. I sit in a very recumbent low position. There was a lot of changes that were made to make the polar cycle.
Yeah, I have a nice trike. I have a challenge on my port side of my body and my knee, and I have the recumbent trike, and I have a similar big wheeled trike because that gets me on the trails and things like that. You had it severely modified right from the get-go because it was a new innovation, so to speak. That was interesting enough. People actually ask me about, did she have skis on? And we'll talk a bit about the Traverse. But for listeners in perspective now, because we're in North Bay, Ontario, and to the south is Toronto. So the trek was approximately 638 kilometers or 396 miles over a 10-day period, and that was important for the record. And so that's like driving from North Bay to Toronto and back, and that's what you did to get to the South Pole. But you talked a little bit about the inspiration of doing this and how it comes out in the video as well, how hell-bent you were to do this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't hide the fact that the reason that I wanted to do this, the number one reason I wanted to do this, was because I was so excited about the fact that nobody'd ever done it before. To be the first out of, 8 billion people on this planet to achieve something like that was definitely my over driving desire. So I was, at the time when I came up with this idea, I was actually in New Zealand. I'd taken a career break. I was struggling a lot with work. I sort of had some kind of mental health challenges in terms of high anxiety and stress levels and things. And so I decided the best thing to do was, I guess, run away a little bit. So I went to New Zealand and I took my bike because I love cycling. And I just spent 30 days cycling the length of New Zealand from the far north to the far south. And what this did was just give me time while cycling to just think and just to be me and just to be free. And at the end of this journey, I'll always remember I was standing at Bluff, the southernmost point of New Zealand, and I looked out across the sea and I thought, oh, that's Antarctica. I wonder if it's possible to just keep cycling. I want to just keep cycling was my sort of desire at that point. And then I quickly went to, this was the good old days of the internet cafes. We don't have those anymore, I don't think. But and I went to an internet cafe and I just Googled, has anyone cycled to the South Pole? And it was there. I realized that, nobody had ever even thought or attempted anything like this before. And so it was a combination of loving cycling. I was super cycling fit. I've never been so fit as I was when I cycled New Zealand because, the hills and everything. It was a combination of that and I think I'd always had quite a fascination with Antarctica. I'm half Swedish, so I love the cold, hence wanting to come to Canada in the winter. So it was sort of all those sort of things, just like it's like a piece of puzzle all gradually coming together and formulating a plan. But you mentioned earlier, like the distance that I travelled, and that is travelling from one place to another. And it's really interesting because most people don't realise Antarctica is actually a mountain. It sits at 3,000 metres. So over that, the 600 odd kilometres, I actually climbed 3,000 metres, or probably just over 3,000 metres as it went up and down a little bit. So it was quite a journey that I could not have even prepared myself for, really, despite it taking 4 years to plan and train for it all.
Just going back to your introductory remark about the uniqueness of wanting to accomplish this, that's how we feel about having you in the studio here. And yes, you're welcome to come to Canada. But Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you said, because it was like climbing a mountain, did it feel like going uphill the whole time? Because whenever I think of Antarctica, I think more of like flat plains, which obviously it's not. How much of that were you kind of going uphill constantly?
So the route that I chose to go was from the Ross Ice Shelf, which is not the side of Antarctica that the majority of people on expeditions go. So if you want to go to Antarctica and ski to the South Pole, you'll generally fly into Union Glacier, where there's a company called ALE set up to transport you and manage all of your expedition logistics for you. I, however, looked at it differently, and I decided to go from the Ross Ice Shelf, which actually involved climbing up and over the Transantarctic mountain range. Now, this is a mountain range just over 3,000 metres, and the glacier that I actually climbed up was called the Leverett Glacier. So I actually did the majority of my 3,000 metres of climbing in the first 90 kilometres of the expedition. So at times there was 25% gradient. It was awful. It was like I couldn't get off the polar cycle because brakes wouldn't hold the polar cycle, and it was sort of that feeling. I'd had this reoccurring nightmare about my polar cycle rolling all the way down to the bottom once I'd reached the top, and I'd have to keep going and cycling up it and falling off it and rolling back down, and it was. In a way, I can't really remember the details of it all because it was so horrific, but it was the hardest cycling I've ever done, for sure.
How did you train for the cold and the wind prior to? And then it's evident in the video, but can you take us to any point in that expedition and try to describe to the listeners what you encountered with regards to the wind and the cold?
So I think my biggest training expedition has got to be when I went to Siberia, and I cycled across Lake Baikal, which is the longest and deepest freshwater lake in the world. Now, this is flat, so I didn't have the incline to train there, but in terms of the conditions and the cold, cracking ice, the dangers, all those sorts of things, was the absolutely perfect training expedition. So I remember lying in my tent at night on this ice, on this lake, and I could hear the cracking of the ice underneath me, and I could hear the wolves howling in the surrounding mountains. And, I was freezing cold, and I was on this 2-wheel bike at that time because it was before I'd come up with the idea of the 3-wheel. And the cycling wasn't working, and the wind was blowing, and everything was failing. And in terms of a training expedition, was absolutely perfect for working out how I was going to cope myself when everything was against me. In terms of the training on the hills, I actually went out to Iceland, as well, and I trained on their glaciers, which are fairly similar. I mean, there's nothing that can really describe the snow in Antarctica, but in terms of sort of the conditions there, the depth of snow, the consistency of it, it was fairly similar, and that was really good. And you have to be. I mean, I had to learn. The most important thing is keeping myself safe, number one. So with the cold, it was all about learning about layering, the right kind of clothing, how hard I could work. Sometimes I would feel like I could work harder, but because maybe that would induce a sweat or a slightly higher heart rate than I wanted, I would need to slow myself up a little bit. Similarly, if I was getting very, very cold, I'd need to try and get myself to work a little bit harder. So all these things were just learning points that I'd had from earlier on and previous expeditions. But yeah, I mean, the glacier in Iceland was very good for training for the hills. And then I just did a lot of local training. I cycled on sand dunes, which we're fortunate enough to have not far away from my home here in South Wales. And again, that was really good because sand is fairly similar in terms of its properties to the snow out in Antarctica.
Now, I've been on the glaciers in Iceland and Greenland, and one of my treks was to walk off the glacier and to the coast. It was about a 150-mile trek with no trail, and it's above the Arctic Circle. And that was, but I'm most intrigued, and I know it's difficult to describe, but and I can see it because I'm a trike rider. Is there consistency with the terrain as far as the ice and the snow all the way? I mean, that's a long way, more than 600 kilometers. But did it vary a lot, or was it fairly consistent? Because I'm just in my mind every time I ride, you got to keep that machine moving. I mean, it's like electricity. When you turn on the switch, that's the critical point. So when you have to start and stop a lot, that's where you expend a lot of energy.
So I was quite lucky because when I climbed up the Leveret Glacier, so the first 90 kilometers, there'd been a lot of strong wind in the days and the weeks before. And so a lot of the snow that lay on top had actually been blown away. So it was quite icy.
Good.
I had ice studs. I can't quite remember how many, but it was probably almost 50 or 60 in each tire, ice studs. Which I put in by hand and took out by hand one night. But so that worked brilliantly in terms of giving me the grip and the traction to get up the glacier. So the glacier, was mainly ice. Once I got onto the polar plateau, it very, very much varied. So there would be compressed snow. But then the wind was just so, 1 minute there wouldn't be wind, the next it would be absolute howling wind. And what happens is it rarely actually snows in Antarctica. Antarctica's a desert, believe it or not, but it does blow snow around, so it feels like it's snowing. So then all of a sudden there would be sort of like half a foot or a foot of snow, deep snow. And that was very challenging. I did have to use my hands on the front tires quite a lot because this polar cycle was only rear wheel drive. I'd love a 3-wheel drive one. That would be amazing. But at the time I had my hands to push on the front tires so that I could get the traction and use my weight. That's the other good thing with these trikes, that you can move your weight around to get the traction where you need it. And then in other areas, there was sastrugi on the polar plateau, which is when the wind has blown the snow and it's been so cold that snow has frozen in situ and created the most amazing little mini hills everywhere, up and down, up and down. So that was very uncomfortable because you're sort of going up and down and one tire's higher than the other and you're bouncing around. And so that was another challenge as well. So it was very, very varied. And when the visibility was low, there was nothing. I could barely see my feet in front of me. On some of the days, the visibility was lovely, and I could just look at this, marvel at this amazing place that I was in. So, I experienced a lot of different things during the journey, and that was what was so nice about the route I chose, because I had the mountain range, which you wouldn't have if you went the traditional route. But the thing was, it's quite an unexplored route. So yeah, it was beautiful to see.
Yeah, wonderful imagery and descriptive prose. Ben.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit because obviously you didn't do this by yourself. So I wanted to ask you about the team that was around you that helped you do all this stuff, because we'll talk about, you have a documentary on it. So who was around you while and obviously you did this a feat on your own in a sense, but talk a little bit about the team that was around you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So number one, I've got to mention my family, who when I first talked about it thought, well, they always think I'm bonkers, so it's actually not much of a difference. But they sort of thought, okay, well, she's going to do this. They knew I was going to do it, and they always stuck behind me, which was brilliant. And then, so I've mentioned before, Inspired Cycle Engineering, who were the mastermind behind turning my idea and my concept into something that would work. They were the builders of the Polar Cycle. I also had Arctic Trucks, who were logistics. They helped me with all of the logistics within Antarctica. So in terms of getting me down to the start, picking me up at the finish, they helped me with all of my training in Iceland as well, and took me up to the glaciers. We did all of our, survival rescue training, that side of things. And then my husband, now ex-husband at the time as well, he helped with supporting me as well through all of this. So yeah, it was quite a big team of us. And I certainly couldn't have done it on my own. I didn't have the experience at all. I also sort of contacted scientists out in Antarctica that worked at McMurdo Station, who could share, weather information, snow information, all those sorts of things that they had access to, that not the rest of the world don't have access to. So I did an awful lot of research, and I think I spoke to an awful lot of people. And funny enough, I was looking at unfortunately I didn't get sponsorship to do this expedition, but I contacted 161 companies to try and get sponsorship. I was looking at my spreadsheet the other day. But I managed to get a lot of kit and equipment for free through doing that. So that was good. But then, I had to take out quite a big loan to which is what I'm trying to pay back every single day, which I do through speaking, or selling books, documentaries, etc.
Yeah, and so you should, because we have sometimes these grandiose dreams, and you fulfilled one, but to facilitate that, and do all that. And it takes me back actually to a little bit about Ernest Shackleton, because he had to be a great fundraiser too. But I also know, I think you studied Ronald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, and maybe just touch on that kind of inspiration, because that's one of in school we often hear about Amundsen and his polar voyages.
Well, it's interesting. Here in the UK, we only really hear about Scott because, of course, he was the British, plus he succumbed to an awful ending. But when I look at their expeditions and I compare the two, for me, Roald Amundsen was just absolutely perfect in everything he did, from his planning, his training, his experience. He had the right team, he had the right kit, he had the right equipment. He never hid the fact that his purpose is to get to the South Pole and be the first person there. It wasn't about science. It wasn't about all the other things, which, very commendably Captain Scott did do. But unfortunately, because of his plan, it all ended quite badly for him. I think Roald Amundsen was probably quite a ruthless man. He just wanted to do that and achieve that. But I think to a certain extent, you need to be like that to achieve something like that. So, the fact that he trained properly, he thought through everything. My background is in project management and Lean Six Sigma. And so I love to have, all the T's crossed and the I's dotted. And I like to have plans and I like to have lists. And, I want to just prepare for everything I can possibly prepare for, because that is going to set me up for the best possible outcome. And, a lot of that I learned from Amundsen. And it was really important through my 4 years of preparation and training to sort of read about him and learn about him. And yeah, so I think anyone setting off on something like this, to have a role model to aspire to is really, really important.
What I'm taking away, one of my takeaways is, again, you as a facilitator at the peak, it is that triangle where, again, you no one was there to say, hey, do you want to do this? And then you went. And so I think that's the respect I give you with regards, because if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And as a teacher of outdoor education, that I know. But when you do something as monumental as going to the South Pole, and you've been to the North Pole as well, that's amazing. Ben,
did you end up running into anything bad, like anything you weren't expecting that you kind of had to pivot really quickly?
And there are no polar bears at the South Pole.
No,
okay, let's just get that straight.
I mean, I saw big avalanches falling not far from me, and 3 weeks after I finished my expedition, a crevasse opened up across the entire Leverett Glacier, making it completely impassable, which I had just passed. So
yikes.
I think I narrowly avoided a lot. I think definitely the cold was the biggest thing out there. There were times when I thought, and now I've got black toenail, I don't have toenails on some of my feet. And so there was definitely times there where I thought, oh, blimey, it's getting on the edge here of danger. So you learn to respect the weather very quickly.
I bet you said a few times more than blimey on that trek.
Yeah.
What's the average temperature there in Antarctica when you were down there?
Well, it's interesting because down on the Ross Ice Shelf, it was quite a pleasant -15.
Yeah.
And then once I got closer to the pole with the wind chill, because you need to take that in, it was closer to -35, 40. Yeah, it was a sort of temperature that human bodies are not meant to survive in. You could really feel that when you breathe it. So, you just mentioned about planning and training, and the one big thing that I really learned out there certainly is that control, or focusing on what you can control, is really important, and just letting go of things you can't. So I could plan and train for as much as I possibly could, but there was some things like the cold, like my knee injury, like the fact that every morning when I got up, I sort of would rest for about 4 hours a night. That feeling of making myself get out when I was exhausted, I had knee pain, I couldn't go. I had this feeling, if I can't go, I'm making myself get out there and get on and keep going. It was like, what do I have control over, and what is my end goal? Keep focusing on that end goal and what I can control. They were something that I think, we lose ourselves in day-to-day life when we're trying to work on everything, and we forget about the things that we can't control. There's no point. There's no point in worrying about it, and we just lose energy worrying about those things. So yeah, that was something that was very, very important out there.
Glad you mentioned that, because in science, of course, it's all about the control variables. And you go into this expedition with, okay, I've done this, all the checklists. And then there's that variable factor, again, the weather probably being the one that affected you the most, and having to just, of course, talk a little bit about the psyche and the mental thing during that trek, as you can recall, that were the big challenges over those 10 days.
So when I was cycling up the Leverett Glacier, I remember having that feeling of, this is not going to go to plan. This is not going to work. I'm not going to manage it, and the polar cycle's not going to manage it. And I basically created this concept where I said, okay, I'm going to draw an invisible circle around myself and the polar cycle. Now, anything within that circle, I can make a choice over, I've got full control over, I can change. So I can take clothes on, I can take clothes off, I can feed myself, I can adjust my position, I can do things with the polar cycle. I've got full control. I can work harder, I can not work so hard. Anything outside of that circle, so the avalanches, the crevasses, the cold, I don't have control over, so I mustn't allow myself to waste the time and the energy on those things. And that is a concept that I use now every day. I've got 2 young girls, and when they're having a moment of, I can't do it, mummy, I can't do it, I'm saying, okay, right, let's look at what you can do. Let's focus on what you can do. And it's the same principle. And I try and share that a lot, because I think we waste so much time on the things that we can't control. So yeah, I think climbing that glacier really taught me to sort of hone in on those things.
Well, it was funny when you were talking about that when it's minus 40 and you can feel like you can almost taste it, right? Like when you're breathing and stuff, which is something we can obviously relate to, not lately, because unfortunately climate change has kind of affected our winters. They're a little bit more mild, but we used to get minus 30, minus 35 consistently in the wintertime. And it definitely is, it's chilly. So we've talked about how you've gone to the North Pole, you've gone to the South Pole. Which one do you prefer?
Well, I've not actually been to the North Pole, but I've been up to the Arctic and done training up in the Arctic. I mean, the South Pole and Antarctica is definitely very close to my heart because, you know, I've been privileged enough to step foot on a continent that the majority of people will not have the chance to do. From a scientific point of view and from a preservation point of view of this planet, you know, it's a very, very important landmass there. And I know I went there and I cycled it. But, you know, I'm really hoping that with the Antarctic Treaty as well, that we keep control of what happens down there, and that it remains the beautiful place that it is. There's not many places like that on Earth. So, yeah, I think Antarctica certainly is top of my list.
This has been a world-class interview, to be sure. Imagine having someone who's actually been to the South Pole in our studio from afar. And yes, you are welcome to come to Canada and visit us, and we would look forward to that. It's all I can say is namaste, Maria.
Oh, thank you so much.
You can find her book on the website. I'm going to put the link in the description because I'm not spelling it out because it's a little complicated. So I'll put the link in the description for you. You can also find it on Amazon. It's called Cycling to the South Pole. There's also a documentary that costs £4, which I think is something like $8 Canadian. You can do the exchange with whatever your currency is. I believe that's only available on your website, correct, Maria?
The documentary is, yeah. It's actually on Vimeo, so You'll get a link to Vimeo, yeah.
So check both those out. Again, I'll put the link in the description. And Maria, again, thank you so much. Anything we discussed that you wanted to add or that we didn't get to?
I think if there's any companies over there in Canada that want a motivational speaker, that could be my ticket. That could be my ticket to come over to Canada.
Yeah, well, let's hope that our corporate people out here in Canada and abroad are listening to have you come, and it certainly has been motivating.
Well, big thank you to Maria for hopping on and spending some time with myself and Bill, and it was such a fantastic story and feat. And actually, after we finished, we talked about it a little bit at the end of the interview, but Bill was saying that we should get her over to Canada, do some speaking here. Bill and her were actually chatting about trying to get her to Canada, maybe doing some stuff at the Ecology Center or other places kind of in town here to, because everybody's looking for some sort of motivational speaker, maybe at some schools. We'll have to see, but it'll be really awesome to see her come to Canada for the first time, her and her family, and getting to see her in person, and who knows, maybe she'll make another appearance on the podcast. Maybe. We'll see. Nothing guaranteed, but it would be really nice to get to meet her in person. She's a fantastic person to talk to and very genuine and very, very passionate, which is great to see. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can find new episodes of the Backroads Bill podcast every Wednesday morning on your favorite podcast player, with the video version being found on North Bay Echo YouTube channel. And of course, everything you need to find is found, as always, on NorthBayEcho.ca. And while you're on the North Bay Echo website, you can find all sorts of other great podcasts that are both produced by us at Echo and by other talented people in the North Bay area. While you're also there, subscribe to our newsletter, Echo Essentials, which it's free. It comes to your inbox every Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it keeps you up to date with the news, the events, the going-ons in North Bay, as well as, of course, what's going on in the Echo Network with new podcast episodes that are available and some information so you can figure out what do you want to listen to today or this week, or find new shows that you haven't found before. It's a great thing. So subscribe to that. Free, NorthBayEcho.ca, and we have officially run out of time for this week, but join us again next week for another Backroads adventure.